Okay, this is the next video in our series. This is covering alcohols. As you can see up above, we're going to talk about some of the reactions involving alcohols and how to control some of those reactions. So let's go ahead and review what alcohols are. First of all, alcohols have a carbon groups with the functional group of oxygen bonded to hydrogen. That's how we identify alcohol. So to remind yourselves of a few of the names, this would be methanol. 2-carbon would be ethanol. 3-carbon propanol, 4-carbon butanol. And remember, the location of the hydroxyl group does matter. So for example, the OH attached here would be 2, carbon number 2, 2-propanol. If the hydroxide group or hydroxyl group was attached here, this would be called 1-propanol, or sometimes commonly known as N, or normal propanol. By the way, a little teachable moment bringing up the N issue. When you have a functional group attached to a series of carbons, if that functional group is attached in the center, like symmetrically, so we have the same number this way as we do this way, you can also call that iso. Iso is a prefix meaning equal. So you'll often see this as isopropyl alcohol. This is rubbing alcohol. Okay, so you can see the objects, the curriculum points up above here that we're going to be covering. So let's go ahead and dive right in by talking about the first, which is that of describing using equations the complete combustion of alcohols. Well, alcohols are, I'll use methanol as my example. You know what, let me use a little more compact form of methanol. I'll use methanol as my example, and therefore as a hydrocarbon, which chiefly contains carbons and hydrogens, the combustion of it produces carbon dioxide and water. So if your reminders about combustion, this is a common topic. Complete combustion produces carbon dioxide and water. Incomplete combustion, which could be because of not sufficient oxygen present, include carbon monoxide. Also, you can include carbon soot. Carbon monoxide is very dangerous to human beings. It combines very strongly to hemoglobin, and therefore it outcompetes oxygen in the bloodstream. So basically you suffocate. Your blood cells, your hemoglobin cannot take in oxygen because the space that the oxygen would sit in the middle of that hemoglobin structure is occupied by carbon monoxide. It's odorless, colorless, it's very dangerous. And carbon soot, as particulates, it's for obvious reasons fairly dangerous to get in the lungs. And also another product of incomplete combustion, or combustion in general, especially that in an internal combustion engine. Some of the dangers include the production of a greenhouse gas here, and because nitrogen is also in the air that mixes in the combustion chamber, it's not just oxygen present. Nitrogen can combine with oxygen to form compounds like nitrogen monoxide and or dioxide, which when they combine with water can form nitric acid, which when aerosolized, or put out into the air can produce acid rain. So those are just some of the byproducts. So long story short, complete combustion, even though it's an alcohol, makes no difference, carbon dioxide and water. So let's go ahead and continue forward to a little more difficult topics, and that is in the oxidation of alcohols. So oxidation is, in the old days, it basically meant like a reaction with oxygen. Oxygen was involved, and it's typically not used anymore as the definition. It's not used anymore as a definition. Now we talk about oxidation in terms of electrons being gained and lost. Now in organic chemistry at this level, we don't need to worry too much about assigning oxidation numbers. However, something I was taught a long time ago, it always helps me to understand this pathway of oxidation. And it basically has to do with how many electrons are associated with carbon. And the more electrons associated with the carbon, the more available energy it has. So we're going to start our process off with an alkane. Okay, these are carbon to hydrogen bonds. That is the most reduced form, or a very highly reduced form. And as we proceed down our list of oxidations, we get successively less stored energy until we get to the end where there's very little usable energy by a biological system. So this pathway is demonstrated very often in biological systems, where we go from an alkane, carbon to hydrogen single bonds, and the next least reduced, or the next most oxidized form of this is of an alcohol. So I'm going to use an R group instead of the C. So alkanes are just single bonds, and so whatever the size of the compound, this is the next most oxidized. Notice one of the H's is gone, and that bond is replaced by this. If we further oxidize an alcohol, we produce an aldehyde. If we further oxidize that aldehyde, we produce a carboxylic acid. And notice the number of oxygens on the carbon is changing. And basically, that's why the oxidation name came about. But what's really going on is oxygen, with its higher electronegativity, is really drawing electrons from carbon. This is all about carbon and the electrons it carried, because remember, in passing electrons from place to place in a biological system, for example, the electron transport chain, we are harnessing or taking some of the energy from that electron, those energy states, and we're harnessing it. So it's kind of more of a biological topic, but it does help me to remember. And finally, the last product is carbon dioxide, where we've completely removed those carbon to carbon or carbon to hydrogen bonds. That is the most oxidized form in the human body, and that's what we expel when we breathe. So in this process, we're going to take this alcohol here, and we're going to oxidize it. We're going to start here in this pathway and continue on. Now, it's not a biological system we're discussing, so we're not going to end at carbon dioxide. And as you can see, that the chemical that we're going to use to perform this is potassium dichromate. Well, potassium dichromate has this form, and the dichromate ion is orange in color. That will be important in just a second. So in the process of using potassium dichromate to oxidize the alcohol, it turns it into the chromium 3 ion, which is green. So sometimes these questions will ask you, like, how do you know when the alcohol is being oxidized using potassium dichromate? Well, chromate is orange. The chromium ion, which is a product after this has been used in oxidation, is green in color. So you would see a change from orangish to greenish. Just wanted you to be aware of that. Now the process for this oxidation of alcohols is as follows, like you see here. However, I do need to point out that alcohols can be oxidized differently. And how we determine that is by identifying the type of alcohol. And the three types that we're going to consider are what are known as primary alcohols, secondary alcohols, and tertiary alcohols. So let's go ahead and just start about this. First of all, to differentiate between these three, we need to understand that that refers to the functional group, and specifically how many carbons the carbon containing the functional group excuse me, can't write very well. I'm sorry, my grammar's really poor. So how many carbons the carbon containing is attached to? Boy, that's really bad grammar, but it's what you get for not being well thought out in your preparation. So let's go ahead and demonstrate, make it a little more simple. A primary alcohol would be an alcohol where the carbon that is attached to the functional group, this one, is attached to one other carbon. So this would be an example of a primary alcohol. Anything where the alcohol is on a terminal carbon. So this is ethanol, propanol, where it's on the end, one propanol, one butanol, one pentanol, one hexanol. Those would all be primary alcohols. A secondary is one in which the alcohol is attached to a carbon that is connected to two others. So something like this, which would be 2-propanol, or isopropyl alcohol, as we said a few minutes ago. This carbon containing the functional group attached to two others. And the last form would be a tertiary, where the carbon containing the functional group is attached to three others. So the name of this compound would be 2-methyl-2-propanol. So it doesn't really matter that you know how to name this, but just see that the carbon here is attached to 3 others. That's a tertiary. Now, it turns out that in oxidation of alcohols, you need to identify which type it is, primary, secondary, or tertiary. It is the primary alcohols that when they undergo this oxidation with potassium dichromate, they go through this series of steps that I outlined further in a biological system, starting here to there. They will not go all the way to carbon dioxide. So a primary alcohol, like this ethanol, will first of all be oxidized by this potassium dichromate to form an aldehyde. Of course, the original H's in these locations would all be the same. That could further be oxidized to form the carboxylic acid version. So if you're asked to identify how do we produce a carboxylic acid, well, it's by the complete oxidation of a primary alcohol. Now, it's important, if you refer back to the curriculum point, it does talk about how to control the products here. Well, this aldehyde, not having very weak intermolecular forces, you can, during this process, you can distill this, which means you can heat it very slowly, and because its boiling point is low, this will tend to turn into a gas, and once that gas can be collected in a separate container and cooled to purify this liquid. However, if you continue to heat this and keep mixing it, not allowing it to escape as a gas, it's called heating under reflux, and you continue to mix it with potassium dichromate, you could further produce the acid. Now in the case of a secondary alcohol, which I'm going to draw with the hydroxide up, you notice, if we look at the symbolism here, this carbon in the primary had 2 hydrogens. Now if you look here, there's one of them. Okay? Now one of them has been replaced by, this bond is actually not present any longer, there's a double bond here. Okay? So we've lost a hydrogen. Well, you can see here that if you look at this carbon here, there's only this one hydrogen here. We have one remaining, and we lost one. So long story short, we cannot form the same compound. We lose that hydrogen, and we can't make an aldehyde, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is because one of these 2 hydrogens, now one of them is replaced by a carbon. So in this case, the oxidation of a secondary produces a ketone. That cannot be further oxidized. That is a terminal point. Okay? Now tertiary alcohols such as this one cannot undergo any type of reaction. So this was a secondary, and tertiary alcohols like the one shown above, I'll put the hydroxide up just to maintain some consistency, no reaction with potassium dichromate. So those are the oxidation steps for an alcohol. Please understand how to control it. Remember, the aldehyde in this step here has a low boiling point because of weak intermolecular forces. Therefore, it can be separated by heating very slowly and recondensing it later. The last point is actually already been covered. You see, it's the determination of the products formed by the oxidation of primary and secondary. So remember, a primary alcohol will go first to an aldehyde, then to a to a carboxylic acid if you let it go long enough. A secondary will go to a ketone and then stop. And the tertiary will not be oxidized at all. Remember that potassium dichromate starts as orange and turns green as evidence. That concludes this video. The next one in series will be 10.5 on halogenoalkanes.